The de Havilland DH.60 Moth was a true pioneer. It launched an entire family of legendary aircraft. These aircraft revolutionized British aviation in the 1920s and 1930s. The very name of the aircraft had a personal origin. Geoffrey de Havilland had been a passionate collector of moths and butterflies since childhood, and he kept cataloging specimens throughout his life. When his design team folded the new biplane's wings back against the fuselage for storage, the resulting silhouette reminded him of a resting moth, and the nickname stuck from the very first drawings onward. This habit of borrowing names from the insect world would follow the company for decades, eventually producing the tiger moth, the puss moth, the fox moth, and even the wartime mosquito bomber. Before the DH-60, de Havilland had built the larger DH-51 biplane, and it was this earlier design that supplied much of the engineering groundwork behind the smaller, cheaper Moth that followed it. The DH-60 prototype made its maiden flight in February 1925. The heart of this airplane was the brand new 60-horsepower Cirrus 1 engine. Interestingly, this was essentially just half of the much larger 120-horsepower Air Disco engine. It was fitted with a new crankcase. Even so, the entire package weighed only 290 pounds. The success of the new design was overwhelming. The British Air Ministry actually agreed to subsidize 5 flying clubs equipped with Moth aircraft. The prototype carried the registration GEBKT and the construction number 168. Geoffrey de Havilland himself took it up for that first flight at the company's own airfield at Stag Lane, near Edgware in North London. The airframe was built from plywood-covered wood with fabric-covered wings and tail surfaces, and its most practical feature was that pair of folding wings, which let owners tuck the whole airplane into a modest shed instead of a full hangar. A new Moth sold for around 650 pounds, a price that stayed remarkably stable even as the design kept improving over the following years. The Cirrus engine itself was not built from scratch. Major Frank Halford had already reworked a stockpile of surplus Renault V8 engines left over from the First World War into the lower-powered Air Disco unit for the Aircraft Disposal Company. And Geoffrey de Havilland realized that simply taking half of that 8-cylinder engine would yield an air-cooled 4-cylinder power plant of exactly the size and weight his new airplane needed. It was Sir Samuel Hoare, then Secretary of State for Air, who took a personal interest in the little biplane and pushed through the subsidy for those 5 flying clubs. Among the clubs equipped under that scheme were the London Aeroplane Club at Stag Lane itself, the Lancashire Aero Club at Woodford, the Midland Aero Club in Birmingham, and the Newcastle Aero Club at Cramlington. The first production airplane of this type was delivered to a flying club in Lancashire in July 1925. This was barely 5 months after the initial test flights of the prototype. By the end of the year, the company had rolled out 20 aircraft. Orders poured in. In 1926, another 35 airplanes came off the assembly line. Soon, foreign buyers joined the British customers. To meet growing demand, engineers bumped the base engine output up to 85 horsepower that same year. The updated engine was called the Cirrus 2. It was a massive step forward from its predecessor. Alan Cobham, already one of Britain's best-known pilots, flew a modified version of the prototype itself in the 1925 King's Cup race, giving the new design early visibility among the racing crowd. As more clubs took delivery of their own Moths, a simple color code grew up around them. Aircraft belonging to the London Club wore yellow fuselages, Newcastle's machines were painted red, the Midlands Club favored green, and Lancashire chose blue, all of them still carrying the same silver wings and tailplanes as standard. For testing, they built a single lightweight DH-60. They outfitted it with a 75-horsepower Armstrong Siddeley Genet radial engine. Thanks to its maneuverability, this aircraft was heavily used for aerobatics. The following year, the base design of the model was tweaked again. The most notable change was increasing the wingspan by about a foot. This version received the DH-60X designation. However, it went down in history mostly as the Cirrus 2 Moth. This was the very aircraft that would go on to set a whole series of aviation records. The Genet-powered aircraft was not just a one-off curiosity. A handful of these radial engine Moths went on to serve with the Royal Air Force's own Central Flying School, where they were flown specifically for formation aerobatic displays at air shows around the country. On the DH-60X itself, the letter X in the designation was a direct reference to its landing gear, since the split axle formed a visible X shape when the airplane was viewed head-on. Beyond speed and endurance marks, the Cirrus II Moth set its own share of records in other pilots' hands. In July of 1927, Mary Bailey, later Dame Mary Bailey, flew a Cirrus II Moth to a world altitude record for light aircraft of just over 17,000 feet, with the designer's own wife riding along as her passenger. The following spring, she went further still, flying solo from Croydon all the way to Cape Town in a modified Cirrus Moth fitted with an extra fuel tank, a journey of about 8,000 miles that took roughly 7 weeks. After that aircraft was damaged, she flew home the following January in another DH-60, completing a return journey of some 10,000 miles and earning the Harmon Trophy for the second year running. Another variant was introduced in 1928. It featured a more powerful 90-horsepower Cirrus III engine. This time, the designers incorporated split-axle landing gear for the first time. This significantly improved landing performance. Production rates were impressive. By the end of 1928, over 400 of these aircraft had already been built. On top of that, the company started securing deals for licensed production overseas. For instance, 22 airplanes went into service with the Finnish Air Force. Some of those were later upgraded with 105-horsepower Hermes engines. Finland's Moth trainers eventually numbered 23 in total, once the license-built examples were added to a handful of former civilian aircraft absorbed into military service, and they stayed on the Finnish Air Force's books all the way through to 1944. The aircraft fitted with the locally built engine cowling and Hermes engine earned an affectionate nickname among Finnish airmen, who called them the Bull Moths, a name that stuck for the rest of their service life. Mass production of this specific model wrapped up that same year in 1928. Engine power on the DH-60 series was steadily increasing. However, engine weight was climbing right along with it. It was approaching a critical limit. That is when company leadership made a strategic decision. They were going to start building their own power plants. Earlier in 1927, Major Frank Halford was asked to develop something completely new. He was the designer behind the original Cirrus engines. The brilliant engineer's answer was the legendary 100-horsepower Gipsy engine. This project kickstarted a brand new line of engines. It also secured a massive future for the entire family of Moth aircraft. Frank Halford was already a familiar name at de Havilland by this point. He had spent years reworking war surplus engines for the Aircraft Disposal Company before opening his own design consultancy, and he would go on to design engines for Napier as well, later returning to de Havilland to help develop the company's first jet engines decades afterward. Reliability had never really been the trouble with the Cirrus, supply was. Every Cirrus engine depended on a shrinking stockpile of war surplus Renault parts, and once that stockpile ran dry, production would simply stop cold. Building a completely new engine in-house solved that bottleneck for good, and it meant de Havilland now controlled the entire process, airframe and engine alike, under one roof. By 1929, the Moth's grip on British private flying was so complete that observers estimated 85 out of every 100 aircraft registered in the country were Moths of one type or another. Deliveries of the new engines kicked off in the summer of 1928. De Havilland immediately started dropping them into existing airframes. That is how a new model was born. It was the DH-60G, which went down in history under the famous name Gipsy Moth. Interestingly, the very first prototype of this engine was actually tested on the DH-71 racing aircraft. This aircraft would later go on to smash world records. The DH-71 itself was no ordinary testbed. Built as a sleek single-seat monoplane designed specifically around the physique of test pilot Hubert Broad, it was pressed into chasing speed and altitude records once its work for the engine program was finished. In August of 1927, Broad flew it over a 62-mile closed circuit at just over 186 miles per hour, a new record for its class. And only 5 days later, he coaxed the same airplane up to nearly 19,200 feet without the aid of an oxygen mask. The airplane was later shipped off to Australia, where it continued flying in local air races. Success did not take long. In 1928, the very first production DH-60G took a dominant win in the prestigious King's Cup race. It hit speeds of up to 105 miles per hour. In July of that same year, company founder Geoffrey de Havilland personally flew the aircraft. He reached an incredible altitude of almost 20,000 feet. Just the next month, test pilot Hubert Broad took a modified DH-60G with enlarged fuel tanks. He stayed in the air for a solid 24 hours nonstop. It was Hubert Broad again at the controls for that King's Cup victory, giving the new Gipsy Moth an instant reputation for both speed and reliability right out of the gate. The specific airplane Geoffrey de Havilland flew for his own altitude record, registered G-A, carried a small distinction of its own. It was the very first aircraft registered under Britain's new empire-wide registration scheme, the system that gave every aircraft a country letter followed by its own unique combination of letters. Records kept falling. In December, Alan Samuel Butler and his wife flew a 62-mile closed-circuit route. They set a speed record for two-seat aircraft at 120 miles per hour. Late in the year, a massive endurance test kicked off that lasted a full 9 months. The DH-60G chosen for the test racked up 600 flight hours. It needed nothing more than routine maintenance. The airplane finished the marathon in fully airworthy condition. It covered an incredible 51,000 miles without a single major mechanical failure. The couple behind that two-seat speed record were no strangers to the de Havilland works. Alan Butler was the company's own chairman, the very man whose personal investment years earlier had kept Geoffrey de Havilland's fledgling business afloat after he commissioned a private airplane of his own. His wife, Lois Butler, was a champion skier who would later compete for Canada at the 1936 Winter Olympics, before going on to fly as one of the first women pilots in Britain's wartime air transport auxiliary. As for that 9-month engine test, it was actually the Gipsy powerplant itself that was sealed and monitored for the full 600 hours, a trial meant to prove the new in-house engine could match the reliability that flying clubs had come to expect from the old Cirrus. What truly brought these aircraft worldwide fame, however, were the epic long-distance flights. The 20-day solo flight from England to Australia was completed in May 1930. Pilot Amy Johnson flew her DH-60G nicknamed Jason. This journey went down in history forever. In January of that same year, the renowned aviator Francis Chichester successfully tackled a similarly grueling route. He also completed a whole series of daring flights over the Pacific Ocean. Amy Johnson's airplane, registered G-AAA-H, was a second-hand machine bought for around £600 with money from her father and from the oil magnate Lord Wakefield. She named it Jason after her father's business trademark. At the time of her departure from Croydon Aerodrome, Johnson was still a remarkably inexperienced long-distance pilot, the longest flight she had previously attempted having covered barely 180 miles. Her journey to Darwin nonetheless covered roughly 11,000 miles, and for it she was appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, awarded the Harmon Trophy, and given a prize of £10,000 by the Daily Mail. Jason itself survives today on static display at the Science Museum in London. As for Francis Chichester, his affection for his little Gipsy Moth outlasted his flying career. After a crash in Japan ended his ambition to circle the globe by air, he turned to sailing instead, and out of respect for the airplane that had carried him so far, he named his later record-breaking ocean racing yachts Gipsy Moth II, the third, and most famously the fourth. A few years later still, the New Zealand aviator Jean Batten used a Gipsy Moth of her own for solo flights between England and India and England and Australia, cementing the type's reputation as the record-breaker's aircraft of choice. Based on the DH-60G, engineers developed a couple of interesting float planes. They featured a large main float and smaller outboard floats under the wings. The first of these seaplanes was powered by the reliable Gipsy engine. The second was fitted with a more powerful Cirrus Hermes 1 engine pushing 105 horsepower. The designers also tried building a few enclosed coupe-style variants. However, those never really caught on with the flying community. By the time series production wrapped up in 1934, the famous de Havilland Company had turned out 595 examples of the DH-60G. But production expanded well beyond Britain. France assembled another 40 of these aircraft under the Moraine Moth brand. The United States built 18 and Australia produced 32. The idea of putting a Moth on floats was not entirely new even then. One of the very first Cirrus-powered aircraft off the line had already been fitted with an all-metal twin float undercarriage, making it the first Moth seaplane of all, years before the Gipsy engine floatplanes appeared. Ownership of the Gipsy Moth also spread well beyond flying clubs and record-chasing professionals. After the Prince of Wales purchased one for his own private flying, the type became fashionable among high society more broadly. Alan Butler, the company chairman, had his own specially streamlined coupe-bodied Moth built for racing, with a lowered front cockpit and no external exhaust pipe to cut down on drag. Other pilots used the type for less glamorous but equally demanding journeys, among them John Grierson, who flew Moths on missions to Lahore, to Moscow, and to Baghdad. In 1928, the manufacturer rolled out a new model, the DH.60 Its defining feature was a rugged, welded steel tube fuselage. It retained the same engine as its predecessor, however. This metal fuselage version became an absolute hit. Britain assembled 535 of these airplanes. The United States produced 161. Canada added another 40 units, and Norway built 10. American production of the DH.60 began in 1928 at a factory in Lowell, Massachusetts, before shifting to a new plant near St. Louis, once the Curtiss Wright Company bought out the American manufacturer in 1930. Aircraft built there with imported British engines carried the designation DH.60 while those fitted with engines built locally under license were designated DH.60 Up in Canada, meanwhile, de Havilland's own subsidiary offered its Moths with an optional detachable canopy, a welcome feature for owners who intended to keep flying through the harsh Canadian winter. The new steel tube Moth quickly caught the eye of militaries around the world. A huge batch of these aircraft was purchased for military service. They joined the ranks of the British Royal Air Force. They also entered service in Canada, Iraq, Sweden, Norway, and the Danish Naval Air Service. Since de Havilland had already set up production of its own aircraft engines by that time, improvements to both the airframes and the engines progressed hand in hand. By 1931, the Royal Air Force itself had taken delivery of 124 DH.60 Moths, and the type remained in use with the Central Flying School and other training units right up until the outbreak of war in 1939. Beyond Britain's own Air Force, Moth trainers of various kinds were also ordered by the Air Forces of Argentina, Austria, Portugal, and Sweden. During the Chaco War fought between Bolivia and Paraguay, the Paraguayan Air Arm pressed 2 Gipsy Moths into service as liaison aircraft, one of which was lost in a fatal accident while the other survived to be handed over to a civilian aero club afterward. Once the Spanish Civil War broke out, civilian Moths already in private hands found themselves flying for both the Nationalist and the Republican Air Forces. That same pattern repeated itself on a far larger scale once the Second World War began, when impressed civilian Moths ended up serving the air forces of Egypt, China, Ireland, Italy, Iraq, the Belgian Congo, the Dutch East Indies, South Africa, and New Zealand. Even the United States Navy owned one, a single DH-60 purchased for the use of its naval attaché in London. A real breakthrough occurred in 1931. That was the year the Gipsy 2 engine was introduced. Producing 120 horsepower, it ran smoothly even when flying inverted. This was absolutely critical for aerobatics. After a series of internal tweaks, this engine was redesignated the Gipsy 3. When they dropped it into an entirely new airframe, it gave life to the next series of aircraft, the DH-60G3. This aircraft made its first flight in March 1932. Just like the earlier models, the new design caused quite a stir. It pulled in orders from all corners of the globe. They initially built 30 of these airplanes, but then the engineers went a step further. They equipped the aircraft with a more powerful 133 horsepower Gipsy Major 3A engine. That is how the legendary Moth Major was born. It ultimately sold 87 examples. Some of the very first DH-60G3 airframes went to the Swedish Air Force, which had specifically asked for a dedicated military trainer version of the design. 10 of these later airframes were built not as complete aircraft at all, but purely as fuselages destined to be turned into the radio-controlled Queen Bee target drone used by the Royal Air Force for anti-aircraft gunnery practice. Between the DH-60G3 and the Moth Major that followed it, total production reached 154 examples before the line finally closed in May of 1935, with one very last airframe assembled afterward by students at the de Havilland Technical School. The final stage in the evolution of the DH-60 series was a dedicated military version. This was the DH-60 Moth trainer. It was based on the metal fuselage model and powered by the proven Gipsy 2 engine. This specific trainer later served as the basis for a true aviation legend. That legend was the famous DH-82 Tiger Moth biplane. Interestingly enough, every single order for the trainer came from foreign militaries. Brazil bought 40, Sweden took 10, Egypt ordered 6, Iraq requested 5. China acquired a single airframe for testing. In total, 64 of these aircraft were produced. 2 of them were sold in 1931 to a country whose identity remains a mystery in the historical records. The Royal Air Force's own response to the Moth trainer was, at first, lukewarm at best, and only a handful were bought purely for evaluation purposes before the service settled on the ordinary DH-60M for its own training needs instead. In Brazilian naval service, the type carried the local designation I-1H. The path from the DH-60T to the Tiger Moth itself was not a single leap. De Havilland first built 8 prototype aircraft with swept-back wings and repositioned cabane struts, changes meant to give a pilot wearing a parachute a safer, quicker escape from the front cockpit in an emergency. Those changes proved substantial enough that the resulting aircraft earned an entirely new designation of its own rather than simply being folded back into the Moth trainer line. Back in 1928, this popular aircraft caught the attention of the Polish Military Command. Soon after, Poland purchased its first aircraft through the local representative of the manufacturer, Bernard Skorzewski. It was a DH-60X model powered by an 80-horsepower Cirrus 2 engine. This aircraft was immediately sent to the Polish State Aviation Works for a detailed evaluation. Skorzewski's own connection to the Moth went further than acting as the manufacturer's local representative. Around the same time, he purchased a Gipsy Moth of his own in England, and rather than have it shipped home, he flew it back to Poland himself on an extended touring route through France, Spain, North Africa, Italy, Yugoslavia, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, a journey that stretched from December of 1928 to April of the following year. The following year, the military ordered 2 more airframes directly from the manufacturer. One of these was painted solid khaki and powered by a Gipsy 1 engine. It was personally ferried by Lieutenant Janusz Meissner. Initially, these aircraft were assigned to a special liaison squadron. Later on, they were distributed among flight schools to train future pilots. Poland even seriously considered license building the aircraft. However, they ultimately opted to go with their own domestic designs. Those homegrown alternatives took shape as the PWS-8 and the PZL-5, both borrowing the Moth's clever folding wing arrangement but designed and built entirely by Polish engineers rather than under license from de Havilland. Overall, there were about a dozen DH-60 aircraft of various variants actively flying in Poland. They were flown by both wealthy private owners and the national airline, LOT. However, the peaceful career of these aircraft came to an abrupt end with the outbreak of World War II. They were immediately requisitioned by the military. They all met different fates. By mid-September, one aircraft ended up in Romania alongside other retreating military equipment. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Kazimierz Olowinski managed to successfully fly another one out to Hungary on September 23rd. Remarkably, a number of these veteran biplanes are still airworthy today, nearly a century after the type's first flight. The very 8th Moth ever built remains in flying condition in Britain and is now cared for by the Shuttleworth Collection at Old Warden, a DH-60M built in Norway in the same era, spent decades in storage after a 1930 crash in Australia before being fully rebuilt and returned to the sky. In Australia itself, one of the earliest exported examples has stayed continuously registered and airworthy since 1925, save for a single brief restoration period. Preserved examples can also be found in museums from Finland to Chile, a scattered but enduring testament to just how far this small, silver-winged biplane once carried both British aviation and the de Havilland name.